Okay, so I've got to talk fast because the sun's moving into my window and I really don't want the sun to hit me and have to talk through the heat. So the question of the body, of whose bodies matters, where, how and when has always been central to veganism. Today I'm going to talk about embodiment in veganism, especially through the encountering of violent truths of animals' lives, relationships and the oppressions or privileges we come up against because of our bodies. And the contents of this talk draw on interviews with vegans and animal activists based in Britain, and focuses on the embodiment in and of veganism as part of a turn to and sustenance of ethico-political care in the vegan project of transformative world making. So I'm going to briefly introduce what I mean by embodied knowledges and talk about how these are being felt or deployed in veganism in three ways: in interspecies empathy as a performance of authenticity, and in veganism as a revolution of everyday life. And finally, think about what this means in the context of worldly togetherness. So on the screen, I'm going to share some quotes from these interviews that I did with vegans in the UK. So 1, defining embodied knowledges. The embodiment of veganism relies to greater or lesser extent as a feeling wrong in the body and in bodily practices of eating animals, whether for health, environmental or animal causes. And I agree with what Linda said earlier, that this is generally for the people I interviewed through education rather than actual encounters with animals. So following Anne-Marie Moll's theorisation of the eaten and eater's subjectivities as always sustaining and implicating bodies in one another, veganism can be understood as intimately entangled with not only practicing, but embodying non-violent ethics and politics. The boundaries of the body are permeable, absorbing and constituted beyond ourselves, but within these same bodies that we feel are so solidly defined, there are processes beyond our control. So when we eat, our body is implicated with what or who we eat, and is working beyond us, beyond our control. When we eat, our bodily and embodied choices are implicated in either violence or in liberation, or many positions in between. So veganism asks, whose body does my body consume to sustain me? Whose body should my body not consume? And how can our bodies be differently implicated in one another? So this isn't only an embodied or bodily practice. The political, cultural and social realities of veganism are still important, but the embodied knowledges of veganism and the visceral bodily reactions we have to vegan truths are often lost in discussions of rationality, rights and justice. So this focus on embodiment deploys different veganisms than masculinist rationality approaches, allowing more space for an ethics and politics of care. And I'd tentatively state that this emphasis on embodiment that plays out in veganism, but also in ex-veganism, which I'm not going to talk about today, is the result of feminist lineages. So 2, interspecies empathy. When talking about vegan transitions or changing relationships with animals, humans, society and politics, this word truth kept coming up in really sometimes quite emphatic proclamations in these interviews. This quasi-religious centering of the truth, coming to truth, fresh waves of truth, returning to the truth, was consistently talked about within a process of self-education about eating animals and in the visceral embodied reactions to these truths. So where in non-vegan spaces that truth would have been contested, it was never assumed in the interviews that I wouldn't know or share the same or similar constructions of truth because the interviewees knew I was vegan. So learning these truths of veganism, I'm sort of putting truths in air quotes to separate from making any claims on truth and kind of quoting from the interviews. And again, I'm assuming in this room we share or know what that vegan truth is that I'm talking around. So learning these truths of veganism invoked an embodied reaction, most usually discussed at the violence of eating animals and the body and self who are complicit in this violence. So Amy was saying how before she went vegetarian, she could easily make these distinctions, but once she kind of encountered this truth, she could no longer see animals as different and no longer be complicit in eating animal pain. So animal pain as a potential site for interspecies empathy is well covered in the literature. I'm thinking with Scarry's definition of pain as relational and although absolutely solitary at the experiential level, pain's performance is intersubjective and can and does inspire speaking on behalf of those in pain and establishing networks of spokespersons, which is where we might find the figure of the vegan. Through witnessing and relating to pain, we can see a process of embodied interspecies empathy. So Rachel says, When I first had that revelation moment, it was quite difficult. I cried at random stuff. And then later on, she was listening to Farmageddon and she had to pull her car over. And as fresh waves of realization and fresh waves of horror come over me, shouting, oh my God, the bees, the bees. So there is a three-pronged process happening of method, embodiment, and education that is disturbing the world, the boundaries of us, and who can be empathised with, and how much. While this also works through pleasurable emotions for some exceptional animals, such as S the Wonder Pig, would be an obvious example, the narrative for vegans to make that transition was rooted consistently in the pain and feeling wrong of the body and body processes in the face of slaughterhouse images, undercover farming footage, and other confrontations with violent truths that produced an embodied interspecies empathy. Flick that over. So embodied knowledge becomes, through pain and confrontation with violent truth, entangled with feelings of guilt and wrongness. And eventually, after ending the body violences of eating animals, for vegans, there was a need to perform the authenticity of the embodiment of veganism. And I found a particular power in claiming embodied knowledges. This knowledge originates in my body, it's mine, you can't deny it. And this doesn't just play out in feeling wrong or feeling bad when learning about animal agriculture, but is reproduced in narratives of veganism, allowing a body to feel good or to return to purity. Where violent truths inspire embodied interspecies empathy, leading to becoming vegan, there's also a process of transformation of self that seeks to perform the embodiment of veganism as goodness, purity, and authentic. So Charlie says, I'm doing this for how my body feels, my body's comfort, but he also talks about the conflict he has in performing doing the right thing, and says it is part of a performance of what a body should look like. It should reproduce goodness and purity. The embodiment of vegan truths require a political and social performance of veganism, performative in the Butler sense, as good at different scales, the body, the collective, and the world, to reproduce authenticity in beliefs, but also to represent the virtue or good feeling of veganism, not only for animals, but for the self and for the world. So I don't dispute whether people are having that good feeling experience as either health, emotional, or communal thing in their veganism. These performances must be understood as both demanded and upheld by the surveillance of non-vegans and mainstream society to push back against stereotypes of vegans as angry and moral superiority, but also by self-surveillance and surveillance within the vegan community. This is an ethical good practice, therefore I must perform goodness, become a body of virtue and light. So the performance, as well as its practice and belief of veganism, is a multi-layered act imbued with political and social meaning. And these internal and external pressures on being vegan and defending veganism as an embodied truth are subject to bodily or embodied self-surveillance, demanding a performance of not veganism, but of health, goodness, and purity, which don't necessarily have anything to do with veganism. And this performance of goodness seeks to counterbalance guilt, the guilt of eating animals, but also concerns of non-vegans in the unhealthfulness of a vegan diet. And this produces the body as a hyper-vigilant conduit that must represent veganism as truth and goodness at all times and in all places, rather than a site of complexity that is co-produced with other humans, animals, and non-humans and non-human worlds. So that veganism as a revolution of everyday life tries to move beyond this feeling, this embodied feeling of as one of health. So embodied or bodily feeling good is easily co-opted into an intensification and totalization of health as a governing norm, which contributes to the centering of a self-oriented plant-based narrative, something that's been criticized in recent years in vegan activism. This centers the body in veganism through healthism, rather than as an ethical and as the body as part of an ethical and political collective vegan practice that aspires to co-produce less violent worlds. But the body in veganism is more than health, and it does more than health. Veganism can shift eating beyond the body, situating the body instead as a site of transformative possibility for different multi-species futures and worlds. Veganism as an ethico-political feeling good has the potential to ungovern the body. And this was found particularly in conversations about transformations of everyday life, about these feelings of guilt, about how people came into veganism through intimate everyday conversations. I've got some examples on the screen. So I want to contend that these embodied knowledges and bodily practices have political potential in revolutionising everyday life through the act itself of living vegan. Paying attention to the embodied elements of both knowledge and practice can allow us to reframe veganism as an ongoing process and renegotiation of body and space, rather than as a revelation moment of transformation that's like one and done. This temporal and spatial expansion of veganism is always co-produced across bodies as a collective practice reaching for transformation and unmaking the world. And this collective care ethics following Toronto or Puy de la Bella Casa might help us to conceptualise veganism as a radical political and social embodied transformation. By attending to the connection between embodiment and veganism, these encounters with truth are being produced in and of the body can be understood as informing veganism as personal, collective and worldly. So to conclude, I want to bring this back to the conference theme. Hopefully I've not run out of time. So in the call for papers, insights on lived relationships, structural conditions, resistance and conformity were foregrounded as collective knowledge that has never been more needed, as the crises we are witnessing and part of are unmistakably intertwined with more than human relations and our engagements and impacts on the materiality of the world. Through attending to how vegan knowledge is embodied, we might conceptualise it as an ethico-political collective care practice, and understanding people's defining of truth and knowledge as embodied helps us to think about how veganism is practiced not only out of compassion for others, but by entangling embodied good feeling with a vision for a just and sustainable future that moves beyond goodness as health or goodness as rampant individualism, and proposes instead that this feeling good should be part of proposing living less violently beyond the human. So I want to just finish with this quote from one of my participants that I will read out to you. So it's impossible to talk about veganism without drawing it into a billion other discourses. People are so desensitized to social issues that we must provide a unified voice. Consider you have an in-depth discussion with someone about the importance of veganism for hours, maybe over the course of several days. At the end of it, they go home and they have a lot to think about. They find some arguments for and against what you've talked about, mostly against. Maybe they change their mind or maybe they don't. The alternative, you have a discussion about the interrelated issues of modern culture and society. You talk about veganism, environmentalism, capitalism, feminism, racism. They go home and they're browsing articles, discussions, free source academic articles. Maybe they start a discussion with their friends and they can't stop noticing how that thing you said about injustice kind of applies here too and there. And suddenly the world is new and exciting and terrible. And so I'm going to leave it there. Thank you for listening.